This movie is definitely an improvement to the first one in my opinion, because it basically fully embraces the fact that the first one was just very imaginative and just overall really out there. So this movie doesn't try to be a horror movie or just be a horror movie. It succeeds at blending like comedy, horror, action, stupid shit, and essentially does everything the first one did, but slightly better and within a more cohesive story. Let's just say that. Also, it's kind of impossible not to compare these two movies, so I am going to be doing that, not the whole video, but almost. Because this one effectively retcons the first one and tells the story in a different way, with the main events of the first one still occurring, but at different times and sometimes to different people, or most of the time to different people. So like, for example, in the first Evil Dead, Ash goes to the cabin with his sister, his girlfriend, and two of their friends. But in this one, it's just him and his girlfriend, and spoilers for the ending of the first one, she dies like right away, and he gets possessed like 15 minutes into the movie maybe, as opposed to the very end, and then we essentially pick up from the end of the first movie. But what's interesting is that a lot of the events just happen at different times from the first one, but they still happen, like I said earlier. Like the tree scene, for example, which happens towards the middle of the movie in the first one, also happens in the middle of the movie in this one, but obviously, since we picked up from the end of the movie, or at the end of the first movie, basically at the beginning of the second, the timeline's basically just all moved, but the events are still kind of happening at the same time. And speaking of that tree scene, which is much tamer, thankfully, it actually happens to someone else, but the result is still essentially the same, so the event itself is not that different. That's why these two movies are so similar. And I'm spending a lot of time on this because it just feels like a lateral sequel rather than a horizontal sequel. And what I mean by that is, like, yeah, it's a sequel because it built on what was established in the first one. Like literally, it continues the first one after like the first 15 minutes. But it's more of like a remix of the first one because it keeps the same story beats and just improves them. It fast forwards the entirety of the first movie and just kind of tells a more, not interesting, but more fleshed out story, let's just say that, while still keeping the main objective of the first movie. The main mysteries from the first Evil Dead, like the Necronomicon and the demons, are explored in more detail, and it just feels like a more complete package, to be honest. The new characters that are introduced are also more interesting to me, and they don't really blend in together as much as the main five did in the first Evil Dead, because honestly, it just felt like Ash and or nobodies, to be honest. While this one has Ash and 4, maybe more like 3 actually like semi-interesting characters. And other than, like, you know, the new characters, the new story, whatever, which is all a plus to me, the practical effects are also still amazing, and they're somehow better, especially the stop motion stuff. It's really, really cool. I didn't mention it in the first video, but there was a lot of stop motion in the first film, and it was really cool, and there's a lot of stop motion in this one. I'd say maybe slightly less stop motion in this one, maybe more like green screen effects, which I didn't like as much, but I did still very much enjoy the stop motion stuff, especially the skeleton dancing scene, which I guess you know what I'm talking about if you've seen the movie. I actually like that they stuck with the same type of effects for the most part that they had in the first movie, despite the bigger budget, because it does help make the franchise feel cohesive in a sense. It doesn't feel like I'm watching a completely different movie, which would have been very strange considering, again, these two movies are essentially just different versions of each other. And like, yeah, it's still obvious how they do things, you know, how they do certain effects, but the fact that these effects are still real in a sense and not just like CGI like you'd see a lot of nowadays makes it a lot more pleasing, and it also just stands the test of time a lot better. And I'll actually go into the whole like practical versus special effects thing for a second. To me, I'd rather have mediocre practical effects than mediocre special effects, because mediocre CGI is just distracting. But mediocre practical effects are at least interesting, because even if they're not the best, or they're kind of shit, which is not the case here, I'm just saying, it's at least interesting to see the thought process behind some of the shots and like how they were able to do some of them. And I'm thinking of one shot specifically in this movie where blood is like oozing out of the wall, and you can clearly tell that they just dropped some red liquid through a hole in the ceiling and flipped the camera sideways to look like it's coming out of the walls, because, like, you know, just the way that the water, I guess it looks like red water. It's not as thick as blood. Don't ask me how I know. it's not as thick as blood, so it just looks like red water or whatever, and you can clearly tell that it's like dripping as if it's coming out of the ceiling. And again, while I noticed, I was not distracted by it, because I'm just thinking that it's a cool way to practically do that shot with limited resources. And if it was a bad CGI shot instead, it'd just be mid. Of course, this is pretty irrelevant because CGI obviously wasn't very advanced in the 80s, so practical was kind of the only option they had. But I just felt like saying that. And also, I just felt like mentioning that the green screen stuff in this movie is fine. I guess it was kind of needed for what they did, because it was a lot more weirder shit going on in the second Evil Dead, more than the first Evil Dead, I'd say. And that's saying a lot, because the first Evil Dead has a lot of weird shit going on, but somehow this has more of it, and there's like some necessary components that kind of need a green screen, so I'll respect it. And I honestly heard so much about these movies before I ever even watched them, and I never understood what the hype was about. And honestly, even after seeing the first one, I was like, yeah, like this is good, but cult classic seems like a lot. Like this, people might seem like they're gassing it a little bit, but it makes a lot more sense after seeing Evil Dead 2. The fact that damn near every shot is at least somewhat interesting, and that's, again, like I mentioned in the first one's review, just a product of being directed by Sam Raimi, and the never-ending number of interesting visuals, be it the makeup of the demons, the copious amount of blood flying everywhere, which were also present in the first one, and were also great in the first one, but somehow they're even better in the second one. Or Ash fighting a literal plastic skeletons. Like, I could promise you, I can literally tell this is a skeleton, guys. This movie just has so much to offer for people who enjoy horror, and that can't be understated any harder. I would give this movie a grade of 9. I can't give this a 10 because it's objectively not a perfect movie, and it cannot be, because there's too many obvious flaws that usually aren't present in a lot of like high caliber, high quality, or at least considered high caliber / high quality movies. But this is literally such an interesting and fun experience, and it's so out there and it's so crazy wacky that it'd be criminal for me to put it any lower than that. So a 9 is what it gets.